Okay, we can get started. Um, my name is Melissa Niles. I'm the Urban Agriculture Liaison for South Dakota Specialty Producers Association. I would like to thank you for joining us for Cultivating Morel Mushrooms in Production with Erin Hamilton. Erin is the founder and chief, my, you might have to help me with this one, Erin,
It's
mycologist.
mycologist,
Okay,
the science, the study of science of mushrooms. It's just very
excellent. Yes, you have some really cool projects going on. I can't wait to hear about them. This webinar is funded through this conservation collaboration agreement between the Natural Resource Conservation Service and the South Dakota Specialty Producers Association to promote sustainable agriculture practices, environmental stewardship. Its contents are solely the responsibility of the authors and do not represent the official views of the USDA or NRCS. She will give us her contact information. She is part of the Mushroom Conservatory out in Michigan. And welcome, Erin.
Thank you so much for having me. Let's see. I'm not sure how to turn my video on here or if it's a thing. Let's see. I guess I only have audio capability on here. Oh, there we go. There we are. All right. Well, yeah, it's a treat to be here. I was really excited when you reached out. I love food, anything to do with specialty foods. I'm actually the president of Soil to Service, which is a nonprofit based out of Detroit. And they own the Detroit Institute of Gastronomy, and they do a huge amount of work regionally to connect really great farmers with really great chefs. And it's just been phenomenal to be involved with that. But my main thing is that I own the Mushroom Conservatory, and I did not plan on becoming the mushroom lady. I actually was in advertising for 12 years, and this was the biggest rabbit hole that took over my life by storm. And I actually was just driving down the road one day, headed into the design studio, and I saw this sign on the side of the road that was like mushroom growing or mushroom foraging workshop today. And I saw it and it was starting in like 5 minutes. And I was like, that just sounds amazing. I need to check it out. And I did. And we spent about 3 hours in the woods, just adventuring and exploring and learning so much. And I got to the end of the workshop and I was like, I'm totally going to pick the wrong mushroom and die. So that led me to just really digging. And at that point, there wasn't a lot of information available on just like how to grow mushrooms. And so I started like reading and researching and digging and going on these like really obscure internet forums, trying to understand, how do you grow mushrooms? And I started with oyster mushrooms. And once I tried that, I was just blown away. It was such an incredible experience. And I fell in love with it. And so the Mushroom Conservatory really came from wanting to share that with people. I just was telling people, like, hey, try growing this, do this. And I wound up making science kits, and those went viral in the homeschool and private school communities. And from there, it just kind of rolled out into, I was getting letters from parents all over the place that were like, well, we want to grow mushrooms for our gardens or the farmer's market or, whatever. And can you come up with a kit that is more suited to that? So we got into that, and then I started teaching and like fell in love with education, and then that took me into this rabbit hole of mycoremediation, which is the actual process of using mushrooms to clean up the environment and remove contaminants from land and water so that you can really regenerate land that was otherwise completely useless in a way that is way more effective than conventional remediation practices. So it's been all this huge spider web. I wound up writing for Mother Earth News, which I believe is where we connected. And that has been an amazing outlet and team to work with. And I write for them a lot and do a lot of their events and programs and stuff. And so it's just been a journey. But, I'm from Michigan and we love our Morels here. And so that's always been the thing is, people come up to me and they're like, do you, can I grow morels or, do you have a good morel picking spot? And I'm actually not good at finding them in the wild. And like you would think I'd be great at it. I do. Some people have this eye where they can see a morel from a mile away, and I'm more Like I just don't see them and if out of my own space. So you start reading, digging, and at that point, nobody had really figured out how to go about growing morels or, causing them to grow. There's, a lot of folklore, you should put your morels as you forage them into like an onion bag. So the spores fall out as you're walking around and maybe you get a little bit happening there. But it is really this great mystery, like oyster mushrooms are very easy to grow. You can start them on brown rice. Like 6 weeks later, a couple weeks later, you put that in a bucket with like coffee grounds or straw. So from start to finish, you're looking at like 6 to 8 weeks, and you've got a harvest with those, which is great. And in the specialty food realm, important to note that like oyster mushrooms, you're looking at $16 to $18 a pound at retail. So that is a phenomenal, really profitable way to get into mushroom growing with a low risk because they are very forgiving to grow and a fairly high profit margin for what it takes to do. So there's that, but then on this opposite end of the spectrum, people finally start figuring out how to grow, cultivate. You can do indoor cultivation of morels, and they are doing it in China. None of the morels they're bringing out from that really have any flavor, so they look right, and they're identified like genetically as a morel, but they don't taste like what you're looking for. And so you have to grow them outdoors. And what people found is there are two criteria. One is they need a winter. If you don't have a winter season, then you're not going to have morels that grow. They need that below freezing and then thaw in order to actually propagate and begin to fruit. That's when the mushrooms begin to appear. The other thing is they take 5 to 7 years to actually grow. I've known a few people who have followed my process who have had like really quick success, like within a year or two. And that's very rare to have that happen. You're very fortunate if that happens. But in general, this is a time commitment. Think like Christmas tree farming or something like that. It requires that kind of patience, less hands-on maintenance from start to finish, but it is a long game crop. So to grow morels, the best way to go about it is you can either take a morel, like an actual fresh morel mushroom or a dried one, or you can take a morel culture, which we do make morel culture, and you can use that in this process. It's either or, whatever you have is great. And so you take your mushroom, it's unbelievable how this works. You take your mushroom and just either or, you could use the mushroom or the culture. You put that in the blender with about a tablespoon of molasses. And then you fill that the rest of the way with water, blitz it for a couple minutes or for a couple seconds, and then you let that sit overnight and it just kind of does its thing. And then you take that and you put it in a 5 gallon bucket with like 2 or 3 scoops of ashes from a wood fire, like bonfire pit, fireplace. You want to kind of lean towards where hardwood has been burning. The idea with that is that morels really like burn sites. And part of that is because the pH of the soil gets raised up from all of that ash and everything. And so you're adding this ash because you're replicating a burn site. When you're doing this, you have a much better chance of success. You can do it without, but it's not as effective. So you do that, and then you've got your scoops of ash and what came out of the blender all in your 5 gallon bucket. You top that up the rest of the way with water, like lukewarm. You let that sit again overnight, and you put that in a mulchy forest floor type area. But that can be something, it doesn't necessarily have to be actual forest. That can be, land that you've prepared and you're just like, okay, this is our dedicated space that we're using, especially if your, long game is more of a business approach where you're doing markets or restaurants or whatever, and you want to really steer into that being your spot, your garden for your morels. So in that instance, I would likely steer towards doing a shallow raised bed, like maybe just like an 8 inch deep kind of thing. And you could go deeper, but it's not really necessary. And you would just be filling that. You want to be adding like mulch and leaves and some wood chips, some good loamy soil, and let that kind of just build up. and you would be pouring it onto that instead of in a forest space. You don't want direct sunlight. A little shady is good. A little sun is okay. It's not going to keep them from growing. A lot of people think that mushrooms have to grow in total darkness, which is not true for the most part. They actually don't photosynthesize the way a plant does, but they do use sun or light as their direction. And they tend to have higher levels of nutrients if they do get some sunlight. So you do want to have, kind of a nice sun dappled spot that has, some decent shade, but not too much. And so what you're doing is you're just getting this space set up nicely so that it feels foresty, really. And then you're going to put your morels there. And then the real secret is just to leave it alone and wait. And a lot of people will start them and then forget where they planted them. It's a thing, or people move, and so they'll just kind of go on. So it's definitely, you want to set these up in a spot where, whether it's somewhere where you live or you're keeping long term, or it's somewhere where is going to be accessible long term, you really want to think longevity with how you set this up. But, it's very rewarding when you do have success at that, because they're valuable, they're delicious, and they're beautiful. And it's very rare to find anyone who is commercially cultivating in that way. So, I mean, I think everyone that I know that works markets that does carry them they have a team of people doing wild foraging and bringing them in weekly. They haven't had that time to build up, a 7 year little plot. Um, but you can do a lot with it. And, if you have forest area where you're just, fortunate and you've got woods that you can work with, there's no reason not to just really steer into that natural environment and work them right into your forest, anywhere you're not constantly walking or going through with a four-wheeler or something, you might as well just do a bunch of those buckets up and work it through your forest, and really steer into your natural space to work with there, because then you're gonna have a lot less work to do on your own. And then you can go, gee, I'm so good at finding these in the woods. But yeah, so that's the rough idea of how you grow morels. You make that slurry. Again, you could either use a fresh mushroom, or you could actually just use a culture. Looking to see, this is actually a shiitake culture that I have right here, but they come in a syringe, and we culture these here. You'll see different colors of cultures. Like, so, it depends on what the person cultivating it uses as a nutrient. So we use either light malt extract or honey, which means, and we use sterile lab processes. This goes through a sterilizer, and then, we're working under a sterile flow hood and all this stuff to inoculate it and come up with just very clean cultures that, people can depend on, because especially when you're doing a long game crop like this, it's you really want it to work, and you really want to know that you have a clean culture. It is common in the mushroom world. There's a lot of people that make cultures, and there are a lot of people that make really good cultures. And I'm always happy to, if there's a culture you're looking for that I don't carry, or you just want to try a couple of different strains, I'm happy to point you towards culture cultivators that I trust. But there are a lot out there that don't have, the moral standards to go, okay, we're only putting out clean cultures. So anyway, so you're going to see different colors of culture. So ours usually is going to have a brown or gold tone to it. Sometimes you'll see more like clear whitish looking culture. That's typically grown on like a corn syrup. I am just terribly allergic to corn, actually, which was the initial reason we never really got into that. But I do think you get a better culture growing it off of the malt extract and honey. So anyway, so this is a liquid culture, and what happens is we basically take water, and you only add about 4% of a nutrient to it, whatever that is that you're going to use. And that gets sterilized. And then you take mushroom tissue, whether that's directly from a mushroom, and you're taking that from the middle of the mushroom. Well, it's certainly, you don't have to remember this part. I'm just telling you how culture works at this point. But but you're going to take that mushroom tissue, or you can take, like, a lot of times we'll grow out of mushroom tissue on a petri dish. And we do that because you might get a little piece of that mushroom tissue that's really clean, but parts of it are going to be contaminated just because there's so much ambient, spores, mold, everything in the air, just even completely normal, healthy air, what we would consider safe, reasonable living standards. There are just all kinds of microorganisms floating around us. And so you want to get the cleanest sample possible from that mushroom, and sometimes it's just not possible to do that. So what you do in that case, and in general the right way to do it, is to take that sample and then you put it on agar and a petri dish and you let it grow out. And it'll actually look like this beautiful white snowflake that grows over the top of the surface when it's really clean. But if you wind up with a sample that might have some contamination in it, you'll see little spots of like mold, some green or pink or blue stuff you don't want to see in there. And what happens when that happens is you just find the clean spot where it's just that fluffy white mycelium, and you scoop that and then you put that on a fresh petri dish and you let that grow out. And hopefully that's clean. And if it's not, then you take another little sample and you keep doing that until you have a perfectly clean petri dish. And at that point, you add that to your sterilized water and nutrient medium, and then we let that grow out in there. And it begins to look, I doubt that you can see this very clearly on here, but it starts looking like almost a gel in there. And that is actually living mushroom tissue. It's called mycelium. Mycelium, if you're not familiar, is the underground network of the mushroom. The mushroom is actually just a fruiting body of mycelium. Mycelium is the real core of it all. And trees in the forest use mycelium to send electrical impulses to their seedlings, and the whole forest uses it to communicate across and go, hey, you need more nutrition, you need more water, there's danger coming. So it's very interesting. There's a lot of research going on with mycelium, but basically what happens is you grow out that mycelium in your culture. And this is across the board with many, many species of mushrooms for mushroom growing. And so then you have this, and this is really like the magic sauce for growing mushrooms. And so you can add this to if you're doing a morel slurry type thing, like I'm describing, then you would just be putting this directly in the blender. And usually I would say use the whole syringe if you're doing a blender full whole syringe. This is a 10 milliliter syringe. Um, you put that in the blender with your molasses, let it do its thing. If you were doing other kinds of mushrooms, you would actually start this on a grain. You would take like rice that's been sterilized, or I do a lot with rye, various grains. And you actually just add like to maybe a quart size bag, you would only add about 1 milliliter of this to that and let it grow out on there. And then that, once it's grown out, it'll be kind of covered this fluffy white stuff called mycelium. And so what happens is you can then crumble that into whatever you want to grow on. And it's amazing because one of those little quart-sized bags of grain with just 1 milliliter of culture on it is enough to start about a 5-gallon bucket growing with mushrooms. So it's extremely exponential. It's very interesting how culture works. But in the case of doing a morel slurry, you would do the exact same thing that you do with the mushroom, only you would just take a full 10 ml syringe, put that in your blender with your molasses and your water, and just blitz it for just a second, and then let that sit overnight. And then again, you add that to the 5-gallon bucket with a few scoops of ash, and just fill it with water the rest of the way. And then to a nice mulchy forest floor type area where it can do its thing. And I do recommend that you are checking on it sooner than 7 years, because you never know. You never know what you may find. But and then the other thing is there are false morel out there. Um, they tend, once you've spent a long time staring at morels, it becomes more obvious. Morels tend to have this, like the photo behind you. You've got the true morels there, and they've got this very nice, kind of like crisp lines. It almost looks like bark, on an old tree. And with false morels, it's got kind of more of a brainy, squishy look to it. And then you'll also find that a real morel has a hollow stem and the cap itself is hollow, whereas a false morel, it's either going to be mostly or completely filled in. So all that to say, you do want to be very conscious of, even if you're like, I planted my morels there and I've been waiting for my morels there and now I'm seeing my morels there. You want to make absolutely certain that those truly are the morels you started and that there's just not by some off chance a false morel there because those can really be very unpleasant to to consume. Uh, yeah, so I guess my last note on the foraging safety side of things is I don't know necessarily where you're at, what the rules are. In Michigan, in order to sell wild forage mushrooms, you have to go through our wild mushroom foraging certification through the state. And it's a 1 day licensing program. You have to go through a fairly substantial testing process and get everything very correct. Um, but that gives you license to sell mushrooms that you wild foraged, or you can work as an identifier for another company. So it's nice because it does work in some layers of safety there. If you're cultivating mushrooms, you don't have to go through that process in Michigan. And so, check into your local laws just to make sure, but a really good way to work with that if you do have something like that is there are typically quite a few people with that certification that are available to bring on as a consultant. And so you can just have them be like yes, that's what you're after. No, that's not what you're after. So it can be a nice, even if it's not required, it's just a nice extra mental piece to your uh, process. And then again, if you're cultivating and it's in your growing space and not off in the woods, then the rules are not as stringent. But yeah, so
I know we have a mushroom grower in Rapid City, Black Hills Mushrooms, and he does offer a class on identifying and foraging. So
oh, very
that is
cool,
available in South Dakota.
very
I'm not sure
cool,
about the laws, but I know that there's a class available. So
very cool. I am just now this year really getting into my foraging groove. I've been out of my mind about mushrooms for I think about 11 years now. And it really just right off the bat, it really intimidated me. And one of the best pieces of advice I got after like 3 years of just kind of this panicked, like, I can't remember all the mushrooms enough to keep track of what's okay and what's not. This really nice lady was like, oh, well, stop trying to know all of them at once. You want to start with one that is, you're like, okay, this is going to be my mushroom for a month, and I'm only going to think about this mushroom. I'm going to look at pictures of this mushroom. I'm going to read about this mushroom. I'm going to try and find this mushroom and really, maybe get, get the opportunity to taste it, try cooking with it, and just, develop a relationship with it. And at that point, then, it kind of becomes a friend that you can recognize. And so that really helped me. And so now I've got like, my standard mushrooms, I feel pretty good about my idea on. But even now, I'm still very, very cautious, and it's probably limited to about six six species of mushrooms that I'll actually go for it and eat right away without checking with someone else. Just because I really don't want to chance it.
do you mind if we're ready to open up for some questions?
Yeah, I think that'd be great. And I'm a big fan of Q&A, so like any questions anyone has, I am here for the discussion. Let's see, have you experienced anyone? I'm going to read your question here. Have you
Okay.
experienced anyone inoculating and raising any kind of mushroom on hugelkultur mounds? These mounds are composed of buried logs and tree branches covered with soil. I have our mounds built for 7 years now and thought they would become overwhelmed with mushroom spores by now. I didn't inoculate the mounds. Which species of mushroom you would recommend? Okay, so this has actually been on my mind, and I'm glad you asked. We have we're out in the boonies here, and it's all farm and woods, and there's a guy about a quarter mile down from us that's been really building up their hugelkultur mounds for the past few years. And it's like, I am so tempted to just like sneak over there with like 50 pounds of mushroom spawn and go crazy. Because I think it's the one thing that he's missing. And I don't know, I'm gonna have to figure out how to get in touch with this person because I really am just dying to see it. And it's kind of the same thing where I've been waiting to see stuff pop up and I have not seen anything spring up on there. My immediate go-to is always oyster mushrooms as the like really easy to colonize and propagate. It loves to grow on just about everything. We are encouraging people to be careful with golden oyster mushrooms right now. There's a situation where uh, there is a mushroom kit, they make the mushroom blocks, and there's a factory in I believe Illinois, and they had been dumping a lot of golden oyster blocks out in their compost, and they kind of just went rampant. And so we've seen a huge spread across the Midwest of these golden oyster mushrooms. And I got a phone call one day from one of our bigger vendors, and they were like, "We're starting to worry about the golden oyster mushrooms. People are talking about it. It may be an invasive species at this point." And so I was like, oh, "Okay, so we're going to do some research here, see if we need to pull our golden oyster kits off the market, or what the appropriate thing to do is in this situation." I promise I'll get back to the hugelkultur. It's a circle. Um, but the so we start digging, researching, seeing what anyone can find out. And the interesting thing is that these golden oysters are cleaning up dead wood and waste about 5 years faster than it happens in nature, with a much smaller carbon footprint. So there's a lot of positive stuff, but it also, has the ability to displace habit or, change habitats in a way that displace the local wildlife and other fungal species. So I talked to a lot of people in the mushroom industry, and the general consensus is at this point, there's no stopping it. And it does seem like it's on its own sort of mission to clean up the ecosystem without any input from us, which is really fascinating to watch. And I've been monitoring that very closely, because it's right up my alley. But we do encourage people, as far as outdoor grows or like even, throwing stuff in your compost pile, we just tend to encourage, grow your golden oysters in an indoor growing situation if you're going to grow goldens. Other than that, pink oyster mushrooms are really awesome. Blue oyster mushrooms are more cold resilient, and so they have a better likelihood of coming back next year. Pink oysters are tropical, so they tend to not do so well through really harsh winters. But the other kind of mushroom that is just dynamite when you've got wood chips or anything along those lines is wine cap mushrooms. Wine caps are phenomenal. They're the gardener's mushroom. They're big and potatoy tasting, and they come up a few times a year. So it's not just like, okay, we have our spring season and they're gone. You actually get a nice window of time throughout the year. And I've seen them from spring into pretty late into fall. I think the latest I've seen them is actually like the last week of October, which is pretty chilly here and usually starting to snow here. So um, those are really great, and also a good like hardy mushroom that's going to establish well. The one thing I was going to say about the hugelkultur is you do want to make sure that you're stacking primarily hardwood in that. If you have a lot of pine, the oyster mushrooms and wine caps don't tend to go for the softwoods as much. They don't really like pine that much, and pine can actually be an antifungal to a point. It won't completely stop it from growing, but you do get the best results when you have a lot of hardwood there. Um, and then so what I would recommend doing as far as those mounds go is actually you would create your mushroom spawn. So you're getting your culture, and then you take your bag of rice and you cook rice while it's still hot. While it's still hot, you put it into your freezer bag. You squeeze out all the air, and then once it's completely cool, you just put your milliliter or so of that in the bag, and then you actually will just use paper bandage tape, kind of like the surgical tape. You don't want the cloth tape, you want the paper bandage tape. And I do have instructions that go through the spawn making process on our site, and all of our kits also cover this process. And the idea is to take you from the ground up instead of just like I got a mushroom kit and cut it open and sprayed it with water and grew mushrooms. I have no idea what happened. The idea is to really take you through that process of making spawn, working with culture, and then creating your substrate and learning to grow mushrooms. And so what you do is you add this to rice, you let that sit and breathe and colonize for a few weeks. It gets covered with mycelium. Then you take wood chips, or a lot of time you'll do oyster mushrooms do really well on straw, but in this instance, let's just say wood chips because that's the subject at hand. Um, you take wood chips, you can soak those in hot water, or you can actually do cold pasteurization, which is where you take hydrated lime like you would use in a garden, and you just use a small, maybe like I use about a cup for a 55-gallon drum. So if you're using a smaller container, obviously scale that down. But then you soak your chips in there. And what that does is it raises the pH level way up. You let it sit for about 12 hours and it wears off. And it kills off as much of just extra stuff as possible so that you're not competing with any other contaminants or anything. Then you add your spawn that you made into that with the rice and everything. You mix all that into those wood chips, and those wood chips will then get colonized with your mycelium, with that spawn that you grew. And so then you could take that and work it into your hugelkultur mounds, or wherever you want to do it. Or a lot of people take those wood chips and make like nice paths along the outside of their garden with their wine caps. It's a very popular thing to do. But then for the old tree stem, let me just read your question here so everyone can hear it. Advise how you would inoculate an old tree stump which extends just above the ground. I've experienced mushrooms growing out of old stumps and found that upon removing the stump, the wood was corky and soft and removed very easily. Seems like purposely inoculating a stump would work, but requires patience. So that's actually brilliant. I had never, never thought of it for removing a stump. But we had this neighbor when I was a kid that was constantly just at war with these giant stumps that would never go away. And we watched this man pull out everything from dynamite to gasoline trying to get rid of those stumps every weekend for my entire childhood. And I should have we should have tried that. But I would say absolutely, you should try doing that. A lot of the time, when you have an older stump, it's already been colonized pretty heavily by whatever found it first. They even say, if you're going to make mushroom logs, you want to use some that have been cut while they're alive within about 6 weeks so that nothing's had time to establish in that. Um, but if you're working with an old stump and the goal is to deteriorate that stump even further, I would make plug spawn and drill, and probably I would lean towards using an oyster mushroom for that because those are considered a white rot mushroom, which means they just like to eat away at whatever they're put in. Um, I think I would probably lean towards using like a pink oyster or a blue oyster again for that, just because of the speed at which those two particular varieties like to grow at. You want an aggressive one. And to make plug spawn, all you do is you would have the way you started that rice, and you grow out the mycelium on the rice. Instead of adding that to wood chips, you get those little hardwood dowel pins at the hardware store. You can get them in bulk online. I can only find them in little packs of 20 if I go to Home Depot or something. I've yet to find an in-person source. Or if you're like really hands-on, you can get a nice little drill bit that'll just cut those if you want to sit there and individually cut them. Whatever you do, you can get some nice, just basic hardwood dowel pins like you would use for carpentry. And then you either boil those for an hour or two, like in a Dutch oven, just so they can get really, I prefer a Dutch oven just because it gets a little hotter, but I doubt that that really makes that much of a difference. I use pressure cookers for everything. I tend to I always use all American pressure cookers just because they're like way safer than if you're using a Presto or something. A lot of people are very scared of using pressure cookers, but if you're using a really safe device that's reliable and you know how to use it, there's really nothing to be afraid of. But some of those cheaper like rolled aluminum pressure cookers can be pretty dangerous. They're prone to like pitting, which is when they get bubbles or dents in them. And when that happens, that's when you're looking at like them bursting or the lids flying off and stuff like that. You really don't want that to happen. I've only had that happen to me with an Instapot, and it was terrifying and it took out an entire cabinet. Um, so anyway, that was a sidetrack. So you can either pressure cook or boil your hardwood dowels. You want to have them in water so they're getting hydrated. And then you can just put those in like a mason jar, put the lid on, let them cool completely. And then at that point, once they're cool, you would add in your spawn that you made. and shake that jar up really good so it's all kind of combined. And you want to poke a hole in the lid of that jar. If you were really not wanting to deal with drilling, you could always just use that paper bandage tape again across the top of the jar, a few strips of it, so it can breathe, but nothing can get in and out. That paper bandage tape basically makes a nice filter, so oxygen comes in and out, but no germs or spores or anything. So anyway, you do that, add your spawn to the hardwood dowels, and then you let that sit in the jar for a couple weeks, and those dowel pins will actually just get covered with mycelium. Then you can drill a hole in your stump and just tap those in. You want to use a drill bit. It really doesn't matter. A lot of people are worried that they have to have like a really specific size dowel pin. That's just not the case. Use what you can get. I usually use something that's about an inch and a half long at the most. And I don't know, like yay big or round. I use what I can get, but you just want to make sure whatever drill bit you use is a little bigger around than that, so you're not scraping the mycelium off of it when you tap it into those holes. And then you want to cover those holes with beeswax, otherwise the squirrels are going to come and eat them like little corn on the cob, and you won't have anything in there. So you want to just let that sit. You get it all in that stump, and at that point, I would just let it do its thing. And they do recommend, like, if you're making a mushroom log, it's about 4 feet long, you're looking at putting, 50 to 60 of those pins in it. Um, if you're fighting an old stump that's really in there that you want to get out, I would go crazy with the plugs and just put a lot of them in there. And kind of, I would say, focusing on the base more, so that it would just rot out faster. But that's fascinating. I'll be thinking about that all week. And then yes, a method to sterilize rice or starwood chips prior to inoculating spores. So let's start with pressure cookers because that is the industry standard way to approach this. And then I'll talk about some of the kind of workaround ways that we've given people to do if they're, don't have that equipment or don't feel comfortable using a pressure cooker. So for rice, and again, we really started, rice works great with oysters and a lot of varieties. And the reason we started using rice, I think a lot more than anyone's really been using rice, is because we realized that people could skip over using a pressure cooker by just cooking that rice and, getting it into a container really quickly, so that it's just clean, and it would technically be considered more pasteurized than sterile. Um, but the serious way to do it, the way we do it, if we're doing bulk growing or, making spawn for classes, is you get something called a unicorn bag, which I thought I had one sitting right here on my desk, but it seems to be gone. Oh well, a unicorn bag. If anyone wants links to any of these things that I'm talking about, feel free to send me an email and I can send out like a list of anything you're trying to find. But use a unicorn bag, which is basically a plastic bag, but it can withstand the heat of a pressure cooker. And it has a little air filter on it built in already, so you don't have to use that paper bandage tape. And then you're going to use whatever grain that you prefer to work with, whether that's rice or rye, corn, a million other grains that work great. You put it in that unicorn bag and you add water to it, and again, that ratio is dependent on the size of the bag and which grain you're using. I'm glad to point you in the right direction with more details on that if you want to send me a note. But you take your bag, add your grain, add the right amount of water, and then you fold down the side of that bag. You don't seal it yet because it can burst from the pressure inflating the bag if you seal it. But you fold it down however many of those bags that are going to fit into your pressure cooker. You get those all in there, you tuck them. The big thing is to make sure that however you tuck them, there's not an easy way for those tucked down ends of the bags to flap up, because they could block a valve or a gasket. At that point, it could become very dangerous. You never want to have the ceiling of your pressure cooker blocked, because it does need to have that pressure valve release in order to work properly. If it does get blocked, you're gonna notice it gets loud. Things start sounding different. um, it gets pretty noticeable. So the main thing is you're just neatly tucking those bags in there so that they can all fit. And then you put your lid on your pressure canner, and and you always add water to a pressure canner. If you're not familiar with using a pressure canner, you always want to have like at least this much water in the bottom. Your instructions will tell you exactly how much for that particular model. Never, ever, ever run a pressure cooker dry. But I did it one time, and everything that was in it, I was very fortunate because it was one of the All-American models, and those are cast aluminum, so they're really heavy. And I ran it dry on accident, and everything inside of it turned to ash, but nothing exploded or even almost exploded. If I had done that in literally any other pressure cooker, it would have been catastrophic. But in this case, I had a bunch of petri dishes in there, and they just were full of ash when I opened it. So that was pretty shocking. But never run your pressure cooker dry. Um, so you do that, you put your lid on. If it's a pressure cooker that has a gasket, a lot of them have like a rubber gasket. Make sure that's not getting brittle anywhere. Those do wear out every few years, and you have to replace them. Not an expensive replacement, but an important one. Or if you have one with a metal gasket, which I prefer, you just want to make sure you're oiling that with like a food grade oil, because otherwise it can actually like really clamp down and get jammed shut under pressure and become very difficult to open. So anyway, that's just a side note on pressure cookers. But well, you put your bags in your pressure cooker, and then you want to run that pressure cooker at 15 psi for 2.5 to 3 hours, depending on the size of those spawn bags you're using. Smaller, you can lean towards a shorter amount of time, a bigger bag, longer. And when I say a bigger bag, like a 6 pound bag, the least amount of time I would run that for is 3 hours. I have some 10 pound bags. Those I tend to aim for like 4.5 hours, because when you're pressure cooking, you want the core of that to get sterile. It's not just getting the outside of it hot. You need that to reach that same temperature all the way through. And so you can't really do that by sticking it in an oven or just, diff sticking the whole bag in a pot of water or something. It needs that pressure to actually be able to get that core temperature. So that's why it's important to use a pressure cooker for sterilization if that's the route you're taking. But then on the flip side, if you're doing uh, if you're going to do like a cold water sterilization with with grain, the grain spawn part of it, you have to at least do cooked rice, or pressure cook the grain. But then once you get into like the straw and wood chips part of it, you have more options. So you can take straw, like I was saying with the cold water pasteurization. We used to do hot water pasteurization for everything. And I created the mushroom growing program for the University of Michigan School for Environment and Sustainability. They have a program called their Sustainable Living Experience, which is incredibly cool. It's a whole dorm. It's on an application basis, freshmen only, and they spend their entire year like living as sustainably and regeneratively as possible. They're growing a lot of their own food. The amount that these kids learn in a year is incredible. And so we actually got permission and grant funding to build out the basement of that dorm as a mushroom growing space so that they could grow their own mushrooms and supply the dining hall and sell at the farmers market and really have this nice like student business kind of model. And so we started that. We're in the second year of that now, and it's been really cool to see how that has progressed. But the first day of setting up our first year, I was still using hot water pasteurization for all of our substrates, which would be whatever you're going to grow those mushrooms on, whatever you're going to add your mushroom spawn to. Um, that that is your substrate. And so we were preparing substrate, and we were preparing 65-gallon buckets. And so that's a huge amount of straw that needed to be steeped in boiling hot water. And the kitchen where we were boiling the water was 2 flights of stairs up from where the straw was. And these poor students they had such good attitudes. Everyone was so sore and tired by the end of the day. that was when I was like, okay, we have to try other methods because there's no way I'm ever doing that again. And this program is going to keep going for a long time, so we should probably come up with something else. And so I had heard from a few different people about cold water pasteurization at that point, but I hadn't tried it. And so I went home and tried it as soon as like I was, recovered enough from all that. And it was so much easier. It just took such a huge load off. Um, so you use again hydrated lime. It just comes in a bag. It looks like cornstarch, but people work it into their gardens or land to adjust the pH level, and for sterilization or for pasteurization purposes with mushroom growing, it's extremely useful. Because we tend to do a lot of straw at once here. I usually do all of my cold water pasteurization in 55-gallon drums. I have the food grade white barrels. We cut the lids off of them. And I actually drilled, this was really important. This is the most important takeaway here. We drilled holes just about an inch from the bottom and installed cooler taps at the bottom of those because we realized that if you don't have an easy way to drain that, you then have a 55-gallon drum of wet straw that you have to figure out how to drain, which is very labor intensive. So get a big barrel, put a cooler tap in the bottom of it. It takes like 5 minutes, super easy, will save you so much heavy lifting. Then all you have to do is whenever you need to make more pasteurized straw, you just load it up with straw. I live right down the road from a farmer that grows straw and sells bales on a stand. So a lot of the time we'll just use that. But we also will go up to like, Family Farm and Home or Tractor Supply and get a big bag of their chopped straw. It comes in a compressed bale. And that is so convenient. We use that a lot for workshops. And it's nice because it's chopped up really small. So you can kind of mix it easily and it's just very simple to work with. It's usually very clean. And we've realized that one compressed bale of chopped straw is almost exactly what you need to fill a 55-gallon drum. So and one bale of straw is pretty close to what you need for that. So either way, fill it with straw, put your scoop of hydrated lime in there. I use about a cup for a 55-gallon drum. So if you're using smaller containers, obviously do the math and cut that down. But you put your cup of hydrated lime in there, and then you go ahead and just get the garden hose out, fill that up to the top with cold water, and then you let that I kept the top part of the barrel that we cut off there and we just set it on top so that nothing lands in there. But you let that sit for about 12 hours and then you just hit the little cooler tap and let everything drain off. And then you have, really nice, clean, pasteurized straw ready to use. And as long, I've never had a contamination issue with cold pasteurized straw as long as I let it sit at least 10 hours. Um, if I'm doing a large quantity of straw and it sits a little less time, we have run into some contamination with that. If I'm doing small quantities, it seems to get it all fast enough. But that 12-hour mark is really like some nice insurance. So that works really well. I've done similar things with wood chips. Same thing, same ratios. It's not quite as effective technically just because of the density of wood chips, but it's still very effective and generally gives enough pasteurization to make it so that your cultures and spawn can start colonizing that.
Excellent. I don't see any more questions. Um, I think we got them all answered. I
Mm.
would like to thank you, Erin, for joining us today. We appreciate your time and knowledge in cultivating mushrooms. I
Well,
put your
thank you.
contact information in the chat. If anybody misses it, they're welcome to contact me and I will forward it on. This webinar has been funded through the Conservation Collaboration Agreement between the National Resource Conservation Service and the South Dakota Specialty Produce Association to promote agricultural practices and environmental stewardship. Its contents are solely the responsibility of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the official views of the USDA NRCS. Again, my name is Melissa Niles, Urban Ag Liaison for SDSPA, and you're welcome to visit our webpage at sdspecialtyproducers.org to view upcoming events. Thank you, Erin. I really appreciate your time this morning.
It was a treat to be here. Thank you so much.
I took
And
a
I
ton
do
of
have a
notes.
bunch of I do have a bunch of the instructions and notes and info up at mushroomconservatory.com. Feel free to pop over there as well. You're always welcome to send me a note, girl at themushroomconservatory.com or Erin at themushroomconservatory.com. Either will get to me. But I am always happy to Q&A and help walk you through anything you're trying to figure out with your operations.
Excellent. Yeah, I'm getting ready to clear a lot, and it's a bunch of hardwoods, and I'm like, I have to
Ooh.
clear all the stumps, and I'm like, oh wait, this might be kind of fun. So I was
Ooh,
taking a
yeah,
lot.
you have to have some fun with that. Definitely send me a note when you're getting ready to do that. I'm glad to point you in the right direction. That sounds really cool.
Yeah, it'll be a lot of fun. Well, thank you.
Thank you. Have a wonderful week.
You too.